Once life takes hold of your destiny, it requires an iron grip to steer your way through the chaos. Watch the intense struggles of those who fought to regain control of their own lives. Subscribe today and learn the true meaning of unwavering perseverance.
I pressed my palms flat against the polished wood of the defendant's table and counted the grain lines running toward me. 17. I counted them again. Still 17. My stepmother sat 8 feet to my left in a cream-colored blazer she'd bought with money that wasn't hers, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief she'd taken from my mother's dressers 6 years ago. Her name was Marlene, and she'd walked into my life when I was 9 years old, 2 months after my mother's funeral, wearing my mother's perfume and smiling at my father like she already owned the deed to our house in Asheville. By the time I was 12, she'd convinced him to change the locks on my mother's studio. By the time I was 16, she'd convinced him that my panic attacks were a cry for attention. By the time I turned 22 and my father died of a heart attack on the 18th hole of his favorite golf course, Marlene had already positioned herself perfectly. I sat very still in that Buncombe County courtroom and listened to her sob into her handkerchief and tell the judge that I was, in her words, a danger to myself. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice breaking just enough to sound rehearsed if you were listening for it. "She can't even remember to take her medication. Last week, I found her standing in the kitchen at 3 in the morning just staring at the wall. She spoke to my late husband as if he were in the room." I didn't flinch. I didn't turn my head. I just kept counting the grain lines in the wood. My attorney, a quiet man named Russell Hadley, who charged me exactly nothing because he'd known my father for 30 years, placed a folder between us and slid one page toward me. I didn't need to read it. I had written most of it. Marlene continued, "Your Honor, my late husband, Gordon, God rest his soul, he always said that if anything happened to him, I should look after Cassandra. He knew she wasn't stable. He trusted me with his daughter's care and with the trust he established for her, because he knew she couldn't be trusted to manage it herself." That last sentence was the one I'd been waiting for. My father's name was Gordon Albright. He'd built a small chain of hardware stores across western North Carolina, sold most of them to a bigger chain when I was 14, and spent the remaining years of his life managing the investments from a small office behind our garage. He'd left behind an estate valued at roughly $6.8 million. Half of it went to Marlene outright, which was already more than she deserved. The other half went into a revocable trust in my name, with Marlene named as trustee until my 30th birthday. I had turned 28 4 months before this hearing. That meant Marlene had controlled my half of my father's estate for almost 6 years. And for most of those 6 years, I had assumed she was doing her job. Let me tell you when I stopped assuming. It was a Tuesday in February, 11 months before I sat down at that defendant's table. I'd just finished my second year as a senior forensic accountant at a regional firm in Charlotte, which was a fact Marlene had never bothered to learn. She thought I worked in an office somewhere, doing some kind of paperwork. She'd asked me twice in 6 years what I actually did, and both times she'd stopped listening before I got to the second sentence. That Tuesday, I was reviewing a fraud case involving a family-owned restaurant group in Greensboro. The pattern was simple and ugly. The trustee of a family trust had been routing small withdrawals through a shell consulting firm, then running those consulting fees through a second shell that eventually deposited the money into her personal accounts. Nothing so large in any single transaction that it would trigger an audit. Nothing so small that it wasn't worth the trouble. Classic skimming. I'd seen 3 versions of it that quarter. On my drive home that night, I thought about how neat the scheme was, how the trustee had trusted that nobody would bother to look. And somewhere around exit 44 on I-85, it occurred to me that I had never actually looked at my own trust. Not really looked. I had opened the statements when they arrived. I had glanced at the bottom line balance, which always seemed reasonable, and I had signed the annual acknowledgement Marlene's attorney sent over each January. I had never once opened the supporting schedules. I had never once cross-referenced the withdrawals. I had trusted her, not because I loved her, because I didn't, and not because I respected her, because I didn't. I had trusted her because my father had, and because looking more closely would have meant admitting something about the woman my father had married. When I got home to my apartment, I pulled 6 years of statements out of the filing cabinet and spread them across my dining room table. I made myself a pot of coffee. I took off my shoes. I sat down. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had identified 4 separate outflows I couldn't account for. One was a recurring monthly payment of $3,200 to an entity called Blue Ridge Wellness Advisors. Another was a series of quarterly transfers to something called Pinnacle Asset Coordination. A third was a lump sum of $170,000 paid out in September of my 24th year, coded only as administrative restructuring. The fourth was smaller but steadier, a monthly line item of $950 for portfolio maintenance. Over 6 years, those 4 lines alone had drained a little more than $1.1 million out of my trust. I ran the entity names through 3 databases before the sun came up. Blue Ridge Wellness Advisors was a single-member LLC registered in Delaware with a mailing address that turned out to be a UPS store in Charlotte. Pinnacle Asset Coordination had been incorporated in Nevada 11 months after my father died, by a registered agent whose client list I recognized from a case the previous year. Neither entity had a website. Neither entity had a working phone number. Neither entity had ever filed a single tax return that I could locate. But both of them shared a treasurer of record, buried 3 layers deep in amended filings, and that treasurer's name was Marlene Renee Albright. I sat back in my chair at 4 in the morning and said, out loud, to my empty apartment, okay, just that, okay, because I had a choice to make, and I wanted to make it slowly. The easy choice was to call a prosecutor I knew, walk her the documents, and let the system handle it. Marlene would be indicted. There would be a plea deal. She would do some time, probably less than she deserved, and she would walk out in 5 or 6 years and still have the house in Asheville and the boat slip on Lake Lure and the half of my father's estate that had gone to her legitimately. She would be 67 years old with roughly $3 million and a story about how the system had persecuted her. The harder choice was to wait. Because I had noticed something else in those records, something I hadn't wanted to admit at 4 in the morning. The withdrawals were escalating. The last 12 months showed a larger pattern, and the last 6 months showed larger still. Whatever Marlene was doing, she wasn't winding it down. She was ramping it up, and that meant she was building toward something. And if I waited, I would find out what. So I waited. For the next 7 months, I did 3 things. I kept working my day job like nothing had changed. I smiled at Marlene at the 2 family events we both attended, including my cousin's wedding in June, where she introduced me to a table of strangers as Gordon's sweet girl. She's had such a hard time. And every night, after dinner, I sat at my dining room table with a fresh notebook and built a case. I reconstructed 6 years of trust activity line by line. I mapped every outflow to every shell entity. I traced the shell entities to a private bank account in Marlene's name at a credit union in Hendersonville. I pulled the public records on the 3 new properties she'd acquired during her tenure as trustee, 2 of them titled to another LLC that shared an address with Pinnacle. I documented the lifestyle that didn't match her disclosed income, the new Lexus every 2 years, the week-long trips to Santa Fe, the renovation on the lake house that had cost, according to county permit records, just over $400,000. In September, I found the thing I had been waiting for. Marlene filed a petition with the Buncombe County Superior Court requesting, on grounds of her stepdaughter's ongoing mental health decline and diminished capacity, and an emergency modification of the trust to extend her trusteeship indefinitely and to grant her expanded discretion over principal distributions. The petition was supported by a sworn affidavit from a psychiatrist named Dr. Howard Lindley. I read Dr. Lindley's affidavit 3 times. He described symptoms he had observed in me during what he characterized as clinical consultations. He described a diagnosis. He described his professional opinion that I was incapable of managing my own financial affairs. He signed his name. I had never met Dr. Howard Lindley. I had never sat in his office. I had never spoken with him on the telephone. I had never received a single piece of correspondence from him. I had never in my entire life laid eyes on the man. I logged into my health insurance portal. I pulled every claim filed under my name for the previous 6 years. Dr. Lindley's practice did not appear in a single one. I pulled my primary care records going back to college. No referral to a psychiatrist, no psychiatric evaluation, no prescription for any psychiatric medication, ever. Marlene had produced a doctor who was willing to swear under oath that he had examined a patient he had never met. That was the moment the case stopped being about money. I called Russell Hadley the next morning. Russell had been my father's attorney and his friend, and he had retired 2 years earlier. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "Cassie, you come to my house on Saturday. Bring everything. We're going to file a response that your stepmother is not going to recover from." I brought everything. Russell read for 4 hours without speaking. When he finally looked up, he said, "How long have you been building this?" 7 months. "Why didn't you go to the district attorney in February?" "Because in February she was a thief. In September she tried to have me declared incompetent. I wanted the full picture." He nodded slowly. "You understand that your stepmother is going to stand up in court and tell 12 strangers that you are mentally ill?" "I understand." "And you understand that you are going to have to sit there and let her do it, without reacting, without interrupting, without giving her so much as a twitch of the eyebrow, because the moment you react is the moment her story has a shape?" "I understand that too." "All right," he said. "Then let's file." Russell didn't just file a response to her petition. He filed a counter-petition to remove Marlene as trustee for breach of fiduciary duty, a civil suit for restitution of approximately $1.4 million in misappropriated funds, and a request for a comprehensive forensic audit of every trust transaction Marlene had authorized since my father's death. He also, quietly and separately, filed a complaint with the North Carolina Medical Board regarding Dr. Howard Lindley. The hearing on Marlene's capacity petition was scheduled for the first week of March, which brings me back to the defendant's table and the 17 grain lines, and Marlene weeping into my mother's handkerchief and telling the judge that I had spoken to my dead father in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. Judge Edith Fontaine was 71 years old, had served on the Buncombe County bench for 26 years, and had, according to Russell, exactly zero tolerance for theatrical witnesses. She was watching Marlene with the patient expression of a woman who had seen several thousand versions of this performance. Marlene's attorney was a man named Trevor Ashcroft, whose firm specialized in what their website called sensitive family matters. He rose smoothly and called Dr. Duria Howard Lindley to the stand. Dr. Lindley was a tall man in his early 60s with a well-maintained beard and the kind of Navy suit that cost more than most people's rent. He was sworn in. Ashcroft led him through his credentials, his practice, his 30-plus years of clinical experience. Then Ashcroft asked him whether he had, in his professional capacity, evaluated me. "I have," Dr. Lindley said. "And can you describe the nature of those evaluations?" Cassandra presented over the course of 4 clinical consultations beginning approximately 18 months ago. I observed symptoms consistent with a dissociative disorder, as well as what I would characterize as significant impairment in executive functioning. Dr. Lindley, in your professional opinion, is Cassandra Albright capable of managing a multi-million-dollar trust? In my professional opinion, she is not. I sat very still. I counted 17 grain lines. Ashcroft thanked the doctor and sat down. Russell Hadley stood up. Russell is 68 years old, 5'7", soft-spoken, and looks like somebody's grandfather in a J. Crew catalog. He walked to the witness box with a single manila folder in his hand. "Dr. Dissis, Lindley," he said, "you testified that you met with my client on 4 occasions." "That's correct. Could you tell the court the dates of those appointments?" Dr. Lindley paused. "I would have to consult my records." "That's fine," Russell said, and produced a second folder. "I have a copy of your appointment records here, subpoenaed from your practice last week. Would you like to refer to them?" The doctor's expression shifted by about half a degree. "Thank you." Russell handed him the folder. Dr. Lindley opened it. He read for approximately 8 seconds. Russell said, "Dr. Lindley, would you like to amend your testimony?" There was a long silence. "I may have confused some of the session notes," Dr. Lindley said carefully. Dr. Lindley said carefully, "Lindley, your appointment records, which are time-stamped and logged through your practice's electronic health system, show not a single entry for my client on any date in the last 18 months, or in the preceding 10 years. Is that correct?" Another silence. "I would need to review further." Russell walked back to our table and retrieved a third folder. "Dr. Lindley, I also have here a certified copy of my client's complete insurance claims history going back 12 years. Your practice does not appear in any of them. I have her medical records from her primary care physician, Dr. Lynn Teeter of Charlotte Family Practice, going back to 2011. Dr. Teeter's records contain no referral, no consultation note, no communication of any kind between her office and yours. Would you like to amend your testimony now?" "Dr. Teeter," Lindley looked at Trevor Ashcroft. Ashcroft did not look back. "Dr. Linley," Judge Fontaine said, and she removed her reading glasses and folded them on the bench in front of her. "I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to consider it very carefully before you answer, because your answer is going to determine whether you leave this courtroom today as a witness or as a subject of contempt proceedings. Have you ever, in your life, met the young woman sitting at the defendant's table?" Dr. Linley opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I have not," he said. The gallery made a noise. Judge Fontaine did not quiet them. "Then I would like you to explain to this court," she said, "on what basis you submitted a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury describing clinical observations of a patient you have never examined." "Dr. Tive," Linley looked down at his hands. Then he said, very quietly, "I was retained by Mrs. Albright. She provided me with a detailed description of her stepdaughter's condition. I understood that my role was to formalize her observations in clinical language." "You understood that your role," Judge Fontaine said slowly, "was to sign your professional credentials to a diagnosis of a woman you have never met based on a second-hand description from her stepmother." "Yes, Your Honor." "For what consideration?" Another long silence. "I was paid a retainer of $45,000. At the defendant's table, Marlene had gone the color of watered milk. The handkerchief was crushed in her fist." Judge Fontaine turned her head slowly toward Trevor Ashcroft. "Counselor," she said, "I am going to take a 20-minute recess. When I return, I expect you to have a conversation with your client about whether she wishes to continue pursuing this petition, because I will tell you now that every finding I am prepared to make in this matter is going to be on the record and is going to be unfavorable to her in ways that are going to extend well beyond the scope of this trust. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor. We are in recess." Russell did not look at me as the judge left the bench. He simply placed his hand, briefly, on top of mine. Then he withdrew it. During the recess, Marlene tried 3 times to catch my eye. I did not look at her. I counted 17 grain lines. When court resumed, Trevor Ashcroft rose and withdrew the petition. Judge Fontaine said that was not enough. She then read into the record her findings on Russell's counterpetition, which she had been preparing since he filed it 4 months earlier. She found that Marlene Renee Albright had breached her fiduciary duty to the Cassandra Albright Revocable Trust on 163 separate occasions over a period of 5 years and 11 months. She found that Marlene had misappropriated $1,418,642. She removed Marlene as trustee, effective immediately, and appointed a neutral successor. She ordered restitution of the full amount, plus 6 years of foregone investment returns, plus legal fees, which together came to just over $2.1 million. She noted that Marlene's personal assets per the forensic accounting were insufficient to cover that amount, and she granted a lien against the Asheville house and the Lake Lure property, both of which would be sold to satisfy the judgment. Then she referred the entire matter, along with Dr. Property, Howard Linley's sworn affidavit, to the district attorney for consideration of criminal charges. Marlene was indicted 11 days later. The charges included embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit perjury. Dr. Linley was indicted the same week. The North Carolina Medical Board suspended his license within 72 hours of the referral and revoked it permanently 6 months later, following a hearing at which he did not appear. Marlene accepted a plea deal for 5 years in state custody, which, given her age and cooperation, will likely mean she serves 3. Doctored on their day, Linley took his case to trial, lost, and is currently serving 4 years in federal custody for his role in the conspiracy, along with a restitution order that wiped out his retirement accounts. I did not attend either sentencing. I don't know what I would have said, and I don't know what I would have felt, and I didn't want to find out in a room full of reporters. What I did, on the Saturday after the civil judgment came down, was drive up to the old cemetery in Weaverville, where my mother is buried. I sat on the grass in front of her headstone for a long time. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I told her what had happened, from the beginning. I told her about the 17 grain lines. I told her about the 17 grain lines. I told her about Russell. I told her about the handkerchief. I know she didn't hear me. I'm a forensic accountant, not a mystic. I don't believe the dead can hear us. But I believe that the act of speaking to them, out loud, is a way of telling ourselves what we already know. What I already knew, sitting on that grass, was that my father had loved a woman who was not worth loving, and that he had loved her partly because he could not bear to be alone after my mother died, and that his loneliness had cost me 6 years of my life and almost cost me my name. I forgave him for that because he was dead and because he had been my father and because forgiveness is not something the dead earn. It is something the living give to save themselves. I did not forgive Marlene. I don't think I ever will. But I didn't need to. That was the thing I learned. On the grass, in front of my mother's headstone. Forgiveness was never the assignment. The assignment was the truth, and I had done the assignment. I had done it slowly and carefully and in silence. And I had done it slowly and carefully and in silence. And I had done it well. And when the moment came, I had been ready. 6 months later, on my 29th birthday, the successor trustee and I dissolved the trust and transferred the balance into accounts in my name. I used part of it to buy a small house outside Asheville, 2 miles from the cemetery where my mother is buried. I used another part to establish a scholarship at my mother's alma mater for first-generation college students in the visual arts, which is what my mother had been before she met my father. I used another part to pay Russell Hadley a fee he had never asked for and had tried, at first, to refuse. The rest I left where it was, quietly earning interest, the way my father had meant it to. Marlene wrote me a letter from state custody about 4 months into her sentence. Russell intercepted it on my behalf and read it to me over the phone. It was 6 pages long. It was, in order, an apology, an explanation, a list of grievances, a request for a visit, and, on the last page, a request for a small loan against what she called our shared history. I asked Russell to return it unopened with a note that said only, "No further correspondence." Then I hung up the phone and I walked outside and I stood in my backyard for a long time, looking at the mountains. She played to the crowd. I played to the record. The record is still there. It will always be there. It is the only thing in the end that cannot be taken back. And it is the only thing in the end that matters.